I spoke in my previous lecture about the significance of the French Revolution for the slave populations of the Caribbean colonies of France. And what I want to do in today's lecture, the fifth perspective on the French Revolution's significance, is to say something more about the international repercussions and argue that in some sense we're talking about a global crisis that the French Revolution is at the heart of. You'll remember that the philosophes of the 18th century, the people who are the great writers of that period that we call the Enlightenment, here represented by the encyclopedia, define themselves very much as in the forefront of humanity's search for knowledge and reason, and see themselves as in some sense bound together across national boundaries. They often refer to a republic of letters. This is represented most starkly, I think, in the similarities between some of the wording of the American Declaration of Independence in 1776 and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of Citizen of 1789. In 1776, the founding fathers of American independence stated clearly that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. 13 years later, their French peers express it in similar terms, that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Man's natural and imprescriptible rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. It's the political and ideological similarities between these two revolutions and many other reform movements that are happening elsewhere in Europe that led two prominent historians in the 1950s, Robert Palmer in the United States and Jacques Godchaux in France, to argue that what we're observing in the second half of the 18th century is what they call at various times the Atlantic or Western or Democratic Revolution. That, as they put it, from the Appalachians, the mountains in the east of the United States, all the way across the Atlantic to the Ural Mountains of Russia, that the West is swept in the second half of the 18th century into the early 19th century by a great democratic impulse that, while it does not result in full democracy, as we would understand it, is about constitutional government and popular sovereignty and insistence on liberty and human rights, an Atlantic, Western or Democratic revolution. A very powerful thesis that retains its resonance even today. Some historians argue, however, and I agree with them, that one of the limitations to this argument is that it tends to make all of the upheavals of these years of similar scale and magnitude and significance. The French Revolution, I would argue, stands out because it is much more sweeping and radical than any of the other revolutions, particularly because it is the one upheaval of the second half of the 18th century which involves something that is socially as radical and as transforming as the attack on feudalism. That what results from the French Revolution in the end is the destruction of a whole social system which had been based on feudal social relationships and seigneurial dues. There's no question that the French Revolution is seen by contemporaries as being at the forefront of dramatic change that ultimately has the capacity to inspire reform and improvement across the globe. William Wordsworth, a man who is 19 at the time that the French Revolution breaks out in 1789, recalled in 1805 in the Prelude, perhaps his greatest poem, that bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. O times in which the meagre, stale, forbidding ways of custom, law and statute took at once the attraction of a country in romance, when reason seemed the most to assert her rights. Not favoured spots alone, but the whole earth, the beauty wore of promise. What temper at the prospect did not wake to happiness unthought of? Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive. Wordsworth writes that in 1805. in the context of anti-French feeling at the time of the Napoleonic Wars. And in fact, it's a poem which is not published until his death in 1850, because merely the expression of the nostalgia for the enthusiasm of 1789 is deemed to be politically dubious until he dies in 1850. That one of the important international consequences of the French Revolution is a reaction against revolution, which is very powerful in Britain and also in Germany. Remember that Goethe, the great German writer and poet, had done this watercolour of the French frontier in 1790. Please enter, this land is now free. Goethe himself joined the Prussian army in 1792, but the German states, like Britain, like much of the rest of Europe, is swept up in reaction against the French Revolution. One of the important consequences of the revolutionary upheaval is the power of political and social reaction against it. This becomes particularly acute after the execution of Louis XVI in January 1793, when effectively the French Revolution is saying, we don't compromise with monarchs, we don't compromise with kings. Louis XVI is a traitor, and as such he will be tried and executed like any other traitor. And that is the signal for Britain and Spain in particular to enter the war. It becomes a European-wide war to the death, which has repercussions in other parts of the globe as well, most obviously in the Caribbean. It is a conflict which is fought not only in Europe, but also in the Caribbean, in parts of Latin America. The French Revolution continues to be the key ingredient of international foreign policy relations across that revolutionary decade. There remain parts of Europe, however, which are inspired by it rather than repelled against it. And two striking examples are what happens on the extremities of Europe, first of all here in Eastern Europe in Poland, and then in Ireland in 1798. In 1794 in Poland, which then did not have an independent existence, it was divided between Prussia, Russia and Austria. Patriots led by Kosciuszko seize power and temporarily create a Polish Republic in the image of the French Republic that had been established on the other side of the continent. An heroic failure. Similarly, in 1798, a political movement in Ireland called the United Irishmen attempt to stage their revolution for freedom from Britain, remembering that at that time the whole island of Ireland is ruled directly from Britain. It's a British colony. And Wolfe Tone is one of a group of Protestants and Catholics who together form a society called the United Irishmen and look to revolutionary France for inspiration and support in their struggle to create an independent and free Irish state. In 1798 there is a French naval invasion, which is temporarily successful, and a rising by United Irish patriots against the British Army, again temporarily successful, but ultimately repressed with huge loss of life. There are more people tried and executed in Ireland in 6 weeks in 1798 for being revolutionaries than are executed during the whole period of the Terror in France itself. But the French revolutionary legacy remains one capable of inspiring people who seek some form of national independence, national sovereignty, popular involvement in constitutional government. I pointed in an earlier lecture to the ambiguities in Napoleon Bonaparte, who on one level is a man committed to imperial territorial expansion, to social order and hierarchy, but who in other ways is the man who continues, stabilises, reinforces some of the changes of the French Revolutionary period. This depiction of him at his coronation in 1804 is telling, because among the people who attend this coronation is someone from Latin America, from South America, a man named Simón Bolívar. And one area of the world which is to be profoundly affected in the long run by what's happened during the revolutionary and Napoleonic period is the whole continent of South America, which before the French Revolution is effectively divided into parts of the Spanish Empire and the massive Portuguese colony of Brazil. The map of Latin America during the 19th century is to become radically different, because those areas that are coloured here, blue or mauve, effectively become independent nations in the early decades of the 19th century. They're inspired in part by the French Revolution and Napoleon, the ideal of national self-determination against colonial governments, but also the impact of the great global crisis of empire. The battles between France, Britain, Spain and Portugal make the cost of maintaining those empires impossible for Spain and Portugal. And by the 1810s and 1820s, they're having to concede self-government to their former colonies. The French Revolution, in other words, is to be one of the reasons why the map of a whole continent is to become very different early in the 19th century. They're not movements for democracy. Certainly the position of slaves and indigenous peoples in South America does not change. They are rather moves for national self-determination, for independence from colonial powers. My argument would be then that if we consider the French Revolution in global perspective, it's very helpful to understand it as being both the result of a global clash of empires. It's that global clash of empires which results in the calling of the Estates General because of France's bankruptcy. But the repercussions of the French Revolution go well beyond France itself, across Europe, but also have a dramatic effect on the Caribbean, on Latin America, and are even felt, historians are now showing, through North Africa, across the Mediterranean as well. This is a unique revolution in all sorts of ways because of the radicalism of what the French Revolution seeks to achieve in terms of internal change, but it is also a revolution which has profound global repercussions and which creates changes across the world which make the world forever a rather different place.